It was just before midnight on June 5th, 1944. The world above France was silent, black, and heavy with anticipation. Somewhere over the English Channel, 6 lumbering Horsa gliders were slicing through the darkness, unpowered, unseen, and carrying 90 men toward the single most important bridge in Europe. Inside those fragile wooden fuselages, the men of D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire, and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry sat in total silence. Every creak of the glider's frame, every rattle of a loose gear, echoed like a countdown to destiny. Their mission was simple on paper and impossible in practice. Land within yards of a heavily defended bridge, capture it before the enemy knew what was happening, and hold it until reinforcements arrived, no matter what came their way. The bridge had no grand name then. To the Germans, it was merely a crossing over the Caen Canal, a modest stretch of steel and timber near a small village called Bénouville. To the Allies, it was everything. That bridge, and another nearby spanning the River Orne, were the only routes through which German armoured divisions could counterattack the D-Day landings. If those bridges fell, the beaches at Sword and Juno could be crushed under the treads of panzers before the sun rose. But if they could be seized intact, the Allies would have a clear path inland. It was the gate through which the liberation of Europe would pass, or die trying. Major John Howard, the 32-year-old officer leading the assault, knew exactly what was at stake. He'd spent months preparing his men for this one moment. They weren't commandos, not paratroopers, not elite SAS. They were line infantry, but Howard had transformed them into something else. Every night for weeks, they trained in southern England on replicas of the French bridges built from scrap lumber and imagination. They rehearsed the attack over and over, blindfolded, until every man could find his way to his target in complete darkness. Howard's men had one clear advantage. They would arrive like ghosts. No engines, no parachutes, no warning. At 22 minutes past midnight, they were released. The 6 gliders detached from their Halifax bombers and dove toward Normandy like falling stars. The pilots, flying without lights or instruments, guided their wooden aircraft by instinct and starlight. They were aiming for a patch of land barely the size of a football field. A few degrees off course, and they'd crash into trees, water, or worse, straight into the German garrison guarding the bridge. In the lead glider sat Major Howard and Pilot Staff Sergeant Jim Woolwork. The airspeed climbed to over 150 miles per hour as the ground raced up to meet them. Woolwork later recalled that the descent felt like being fired from a slingshot. No power, no second chances. "I could see the bridge coming up fast," he said years later, "and I knew we had one shot at this." Then, in an instant, the glider slammed into the earth with a deafening crack. It skidded across the field, its nose ploughing through soil and sparks, until it stopped less than 50 yards from the bridge. The men were thrown forward, dazed but alive. Behind them, the other gliders were crashing down one by one clipping a tree, another digging deep furrows into the French countryside. But somehow, miraculously, all 6 landed within yards of the target. It was one of the most precise airborne landings in history. Howard's men wasted no time. The doors burst open. Troopers poured out into the night. Rifles at the night shattered like glass. The first shots echoed through the still Normandy air, breaking the silence that had cloaked the French countryside for hours. It was 12:22 a.m., June 6th, 1944. Before the first American paratrooper touched down, before the invasion fleets appeared on the horizon, D-Day had already begun. Right here, on a narrow steel bridge over the Caen Canal. Major John Howard's men moved like shadows. They were disoriented from the violent glider landing, ears ringing, faces cut, hands trembling, but training took over. In seconds, they'd formed their assault groups. Every man had a role drilled into him hundreds of times. Clear the trenches, secure the pillboxes, sweep the bridge, cut the wires, and hold. The Germans guarding the bridge, about 24 soldiers from the 736th Grenadier Regiment, had no idea the war had arrived at their doorstep. Most were half asleep in their bunkers. They thought the explosions they'd heard moments earlier were just another Allied air raid. Then they saw the shapes, figures moving fast, too fast, and the muzzle flashes cutting through the dark. Sergeant Den Brotheridge led the first charge across the bridge. He sprinted forward, his Sten gun firing in short bursts. A German machine gun opened up from the far side, its tracers slicing the night in red arcs. Brotheridge fired back, dropping the gunner before collapsing himself. A bullet to the neck. He would die within minutes, becoming the first British casualty of D-Day. But by then, his men were already over the bridge, storming the opposite bank. They had the momentum, and they weren't about to lose it. Private Fred Greenhow drowned after being thrown from his glider into a nearby pond, another early casualty of the mission. But despite the chaos, the plan was holding. Lieutenant David Wood's platoon cleared the bunkers with grenades and bayonets. The sound was deafening. Metal on metal, shouts, explosions echoing across the canal. The Germans, confused and terrified, barely had time to organize a defense. Within 10 minutes, the bridge was in British hands. 10 minutes. That was all it took to secure one of the most important objectives of the entire D-Day operation. The men of D Company had achieved what their commanders thought might take hours, if they survived at all. Major Howard moved quickly across the bridge, checking positions he knew the counterattack would come. German reinforcements, armour, maybe even panzer divisions from Caen. The orders were simple: hold until relieved by the 7th Parachute Battalion, expected to arrive within a few hours. But a few hours in Normandy could mean life or death. His men were armed with little more than Sten guns, rifles, and grenades. If tanks appeared on that road, they'd be defenseless, so they prepared for the inevitable. Howard ordered his men to dig in around the bridge approaches. Bren gunners positioned themselves at both ends, scanning for movement. Communications were set up with field radios, though the signal crackled and faded in the humid air. To the north, another glider team led by Major Nigel Poet had landed near the River Orne Bridge, codenamed Horsa Bridge, and captured it with similar precision. 2 bridges, 2 victories, and both still standing. But neither could be held for long without help. In the eerie silence that followed the firefight, the men began to grasp what they'd done. Private Wally Parr, known for his humour, leaned against a parapet and muttered, "Well, that's that then." But it wasn't. In the distance, faint lights began to flicker on the horizon. The glow of fires, movement, the first signs that the German garrison in Caen was waking up. Soon, motorcycles could be heard. Then the low rumble of engines. Howard gathered his men. "They'll be coming. Remember your training. We hold until relieved." No matter what, at around 1:30 a.m., the first German counterattack arrived, a half-track and a truckload of infantry from the 21st Panzer Division. They came roaring down the road, headlights blazing. British PIAT teams, primitive anti-tank launchers, manned by exhausted soldiers, waited in silence. Corporal Wagger Thornton fired first. His PIAT round struck the half-track dead on, sending it up in flames. The truck behind it screeched to a halt as tracer fire from the bridge tore through its windshield. The Germans fell back, leaving burning wreckage across the road. The bridge still stood, untouched, unbroken, and now under British control. But the night was far from over. As the first light began to touch the eastern sky, the men could see what they'd fought for. The Caen Canal shimmered with smoke and fog, the distant rumble of battle rolling closer. They were surrounded, isolated, and dangerously low on ammunition. Somewhere out there, German tanks were starting their engines. The men of D Company dug deeper into the earth and waited. They'd won the bridge, but to hold it until dawn would take everything they had left. By 2 a.m., the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a gnawing silence that felt even more dangerous. The bridge was theirs, but it might as well have been a target painted on the map. Major John Howard knew the Germans wouldn't let it go quietly. Somewhere out there in the darkness, they were regrouping, probing for weakness, preparing to strike back. The men crouched in the mud, every sense sharpened by fear and fatigue. The smell of cordite still hung thick in the air, mixed with the damp scent of the canal. Along the embankments, bodies lay twisted in awkward shapes, German and British alike, lit intermittently by the orange glow of burning vehicles. Every creak of metal, every ripple in the water, felt like a signal that another attack was coming. Howard's men were running on instinct now. They checked their weapons, redistributed ammunition, patched wounds and reinforced their defensive positions. Corporal Wagger Thornton and Private Parr, still shaken from the half-track explosion, set up fresh Piat positions on the road. Others dragged sandbags and debris to block the bridge approaches. At one point, Howard walked the line quietly, checking on his men. He knew they were outnumbered, cut off from the rest of the invasion force, but he also knew something else, that they were trained for this. Hold until relieved, the order had said. He repeated it to himself, like a prayer. Around 3 a.m., the first probing shots came. A few rifle cracks from the tree line, a burst of automatic fire that sent sparks flying off the bridge railings. Howard's men didn't return fire. They waited. The Germans were testing them, feeling out the defense. Then, a few minutes later, came the real attack. From the road leading into Bénouville, the low growl of an engine began to build. One, then two, then several more. A Panzer IV rolled into view, its turrets sweeping slowly back and forth. Behind it, a group of infantry advanced cautiously, using the tank for cover. The German commander clearly intended to retake the bridge by force. Howard's men had nothing that could go toe-to-toe with a tank. Their PIAT launchers were unreliable at the best of times, primitive spring-loaded tubes that fired shaped charges at short range. But they had no choice. Private Eric Reynolds crouched near a hedgerow, waited until the tank was just yards from the bridge. The roar of its engine drowned out his heartbeat. He took aim and fired. The Piat bucked hard against his shoulder, the round flying straight into the tank's treads. The explosion blew one side of the track apart, the vehicle grinding to a halt in a cloud of smoke. The men cheered, but only for a moment. German infantry rushed forward, firing blindly. Grenades landed on the bridge, showering it with shrapnel. The defenders held fast, returning fire with Sten guns and Bren light machine guns, until the attack faltered and fell back into the dark. It was around 4 a.m. when Howard finally heard the distant rumble of engines that didn't sound German. He strained his ears. Could it be? The 7th Parachute Battalion was supposed to land hours earlier, but scattered drops and heavy flak had delayed them. Now, at last, faint movement appeared along the horizon, the silhouettes of friendly troops moving in from the east. But the relief was still miles away, and the Germans weren't finished yet. The third attack came just before dawn. Mortar fire rained down around the bridge, exploding in blinding flashes that sent dirt and shrapnel spraying over the defenders. Private Bill Gray, manning a Bren gun on the western approach, was knocked off his feet by the blast of a shell that landed meters away. Dazed and bleeding, he dragged himself back to the gun and kept firing. "They'll have to carry me off this bridge," he shouted. It wasn't bravado, it was belief. By 5 a.m., the first light of day began to creep across the sky, revealing the full devastation of the night's battle. The canal water shimmered with oil and debris. Smoke curled lazily from the wreck of the Panzer IV. Dozens of German soldiers lay scattered around the approaches, many still clutching their weapons. The British line was battered but unbroken. Major Howard moved among his men, proud but grim. They had done it. Held the bridge through wave after wave of counterattack against armor, mortars, and superior numbers. But they'd paid dearly. Several were dead. Many more were wounded. They were low on ammunition, exhausted, and still dangerously alone. The radio operator reported intermittent contact with headquarters, no clear sign that reinforcements were close. Then, at 6:15 a.m., came the sound that would change everything. From the distance, through the fog of smoke and dawn, the low hum of aircraft filled the sky. Parachutes, hundreds of them, began to bloom over the fields beyond Bénouville. The 7th Parachute Battalion had finally arrived. The bridge, Pegasus Bridge, as it would soon be known, had survived the night. For the men of D Company, it didn't feel like victory yet. It felt like survival. But history would remember those hours as the hinge upon which D-Day turned. Had they failed, German tanks would have poured through that corridor, crushing the eastern flank of the invasion before it had even begun. Instead, 90 men had held their ground and secured the doorway to liberation. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the Normandy countryside, cutting through the smoke that still hung low over the Caen Canal. For hours, the world had been chaos, gunfire, explosions, the hiss of bullets over steel. But now, for the first time since midnight, there was quiet. Only the steady hum of distant aircraft and the occasional crackle of flames disturbed the morning air. Major John Howard stood at the center of the bridge, his uniform streaked with mud and soot, his helmet dented by shrapnel. Around him, the men of D Company were slumped in the dirt, bruised, bloodied, and utterly exhausted. Some tended to the wounded. Others sat staring blankly at the sunrise, too tired to speak. They'd done it. Against all odds, they had held the bridge. And now, at last, help had arrived. From the hedgerows to the east, the paratroopers of the 7th Battalion, 5th Parachute Brigade, began filtering in. Haggard, disorganized, and carrying whatever weapons they'd managed to recover after their chaotic night drop. But to Howard's men, they looked like angels. The first words shouted across the canal were simple. "Good to see you, boys." The relief force spread out quickly, reinforcing positions, tending to casualties, and establishing contact with the beachhead command. The men of D Company had done their part, and more. They had captured and held one of the most strategically vital points in all of France, and they had done it before the first wave of the invasion fleet even touched shore. At 7 a.m., the first columns of German prisoners were marched across the bridge under guard. Some stared in disbelief at the small group of British soldiers who had taken them prisoner. Others simply looked down, too stunned to comprehend what had happened. The entire German garrison in the area had been caught completely off guard. By mid-morning, the roar of naval gunfire from the beaches filled the sky. The invasion was underway. British and Canadian troops were storming Sword and Juno beaches to the north, pushing inland through withering resistance. And because of the men at Pegasus Bridge, those troops could advance without fear of a counterattack from the east. The bridge had held, and because of that, the invasion corridor remained secure. Howard finally allowed himself to sit. He looked across the canal, watching as smoke drifted lazily over the calm water. The place that had been a battlefield hours ago now seemed strangely peaceful. It was only then that the true weight of it all began to settle on him. His company had gone into action 90 men strong. 17 were dead, dozens more wounded. But the mission that every general from Montgomery to Eisenhower had considered vital, had succeeded completely. That afternoon, as reinforcements continued to pour across the bridge, a group of airborne engineers arrived to inspect it for demolition charges. When they confirmed it was still intact, a cheer went up from both banks. The bridge was safe, and in that moment, it earned its name. From that day forward, it would be known as Pegasus Bridge, in honor of the emblem worn by the British airborne troops, the winged horse of Greek mythology legend, a symbol of daring and flight. In the years that followed, the legend of Pegasus Bridge became one of the most celebrated stories of D-Day. It was taught in military academies as a textbook example of precision, surprise, and courage. Yet to the men who were there, it wasn't about glory. It was about survival, about a group of ordinary soldiers who were told the fate of the invasion rested on their shoulders and who refused to let that burden break them. When Major Howard visited the bridge after the war, he found it unchanged. The scars of battle were still visible. Bullet holes pocked the girders, and the earth still bore the marks of explosions. He stood quietly for a moment, looking over the canal. "They gave us an impossible task," he said softly, "and we made it happen." Today, Pegasus Bridge still stands as a monument, not just of steel and rivets, but of resolve. A replica of one of the original Horsa gliders sits nearby in a museum, its battered frame a reminder of the silent flight that began the liberation of Europe. Visitors walk across the bridge and look out over the calm water, trying to imagine the night it all began. The darkness, the crash, the shouts, the courage that turned a patch of French farmland into hallowed ground.